gaming is no longer just this momentary form of entertainment. Gaming is a $150 billion industry, but with non-fungible tokens and true digital ownership rights, we think this will turn into a $1 trillion industry very, very quickly.
I've never seen anyone in gaming put it together like you did. You, I believe, said that the evolution of DeFi was a supercharger for blockchain gaming.
This is where this introduction of gaming and value becomes powerful. Really what we want to do is get everyone involved in joining the metaverse. And gaming is the angle to do that best, because gamers today already have a relationship which is quasi-metaverse. Our children play games at a very young age anyway, and they have the mental capacity to understand actually what is sort of, economics, because they are trading cards or they're doing stuff already. Now make that real for them. And I think that's really, really powerful. This is a way in which we really teach financial inclusion and knowledge to the masses. I think it is the most important paradigm that we need to understand. I think we have a duty to tell all of our children and everyone in the world that you must own your digital property. Because if you don't, you will get left out. And if you get left out, in due course, in time, what will happen is that just because of the economics involved in everything, we will no longer be able to participate in that, or you'll be left behind as well. Data is the most valuable resource. And in the future, it's already here anyway. Labor is not valuable at all, right? And so you need to own your stuff. And where are we going to go when everything is produced for you anyway? It must be, that you own property, you must own equity. And it's not going to be physical equity. It's going to be the meta equity, the virtual equity, and you must own that.
The world is changing. Inspiration is everywhere. It has never been so easy to connect, share, and bring people together. We're learning from others and finding the best in ourselves. Challenging our beliefs. Sharing our vulnerability. Overcoming our fears. Transforming ourselves so we can transform the world. How far can we go?
This is London Real. I am Brian Rose. My guest today is... This is London Real. I am Brian Rose. My guest today is Yat Siu, the entrepreneur, investor, business leader, and gaming pioneer. You started your career at Atari Games at the tender age of 13 and went on to found the digital media development company Outblaze. In 2011, you co-founded Animoca, which provided gaming applications to the emerging smartphone market and has since become a world leader in entertainment, gamification, and blockchain innovation. Animoca Brands is now valued at $2.2 billion after a $65 million raise last month. You believe that GameFi represents the future and that NFTs offer a new way for culture to be stored in the digital world. Your plan is to build a global company with a big vision to deliver true digital property rights for all. Yat, welcome to London Real.
Great pleasure to be here, and thank you for this awesome intro.
Hey, you're welcome. You earned it. And so I'm just stating the facts. You really are an OG in the gaming space, and I can't wait to kind of get into your brain to better understand gaming, because apparently 2.7 billion people in the world play games. I used to play Atari when I was a kid. My mom got me an Apple II Plus, and I used to play games there. But as I've gotten older, I play less games. And I think a lot of people don't understand gaming or esports. And at the same point, a lot of people are also playing games. Now we see this concept of the metaverse bumping into things like NFTs and now DeFi, which is something we've gone pretty heavy in. And I think you've got a great way of kind of tying it all in together. So I'd love to jump in and do that. Everyone is telling me 2022 is the year of gaming. First of all, do you agree with that? And kind of what does that mean, especially based on kind of a blockchain gaming perspective? How would you answer that to people?
So maybe if you go a little back in terms of history, I would say one of the things about gaming is it would seem that almost every year is a year of gaming. And I think when you just take a look at where gaming was, say 30 years ago and where it is today, it's one of the few industries that continues to grow year after year after year. And today, without blockchain and without sort of, DeFi or anything like this, as an industry, it is over $160 billion, which is larger than the movie and the music industry combined, right? And it still boasts double-digit growth year on year, despite the fact that it is apparently a mature business, right? So basically, gaming continues to grow. And I think one of the reasons why that continues to grow has to do with the fact that young people are playing games. And just like yourself, you used to play Atari, and maybe you don't play games as much, but there was a leftover of those people who are your generation who still play games, right? And what's interesting is when you think about different kinds of media, they tend to have a stop, right? Where people, for instance, maybe they stop watching, children's shows, or maybe they stop playing certain kind of card games or whatever because they seem to grow out of it. But with gaming, that growing out hasn't really happened. And so as a result, the population continues to grow and the adoption continues to increase over time, over the many decades, such that gaming will continue to grow regardless of the fact that as an industry, it might appear mature because young people who play games will play games as they grow older as well. And so what that also means is that now gaming is no longer just this momentary form of entertainment. It is actually one of the sort of greatest, I would say, disseminators of culture today. We used to obtain our culture by watching TV shows, maybe even older generations, it was radio. And today that's all video games. And that's basically, because we identify with that culture, more elements of that gaming culture continues to survive and actually flourish as time goes on. When you think about things like retro gaming and all that kind of stuff, that's all coming back. Like for instance, things like, if you talk about NFTs, like CryptoPunks. I mean, CryptoPunks is 8-bit art. What is 8-bit art? 8-bit art is gaming art, right? It's gaming culture, really. That is basically sort of entered the space into the general zeitgeist, not just actually, in a very particular niche audience. And so we completely look at 8-bit art, for instance, as totally acceptable and actually a form of culture. So gaming is really sort of, I would say, has always been sort of growing. Now, what's interesting about 2022, particularly for blockchain gaming is a $150 billion industry, $160 billion industry today. But with non-fungible tokens and true digital ownership rights, we think this will turn into $1 trillion industry very, very quickly. And the year 2022 is interesting because many of the big games that sort of offer these AAA experiences and allow for the onboarding for people who traditionally would be looking for the kind of games that they would normally want to play in sort of traditional gaming are now available as blockchain games. This is where 2022 becomes really, really interesting. And so we're not talking about an onboard adoption of, oh, look, another 1, 2, 3, 4 million players, which is like a lot, but it's going to be like in the next 10, 20, 30, 40 million players, meaning that the year 2022, we could possibly be seeing 100 million people or more basically playing blockchain games. And so 2022 could be a very, very exciting time.
Wow, that's a fantastic synopsis. And while I've got you here, I mean, you were 13, I think, in Austria working for Atari. Then you went up and you were all over the mobile games, back in the time when all of that became really hot back in 2011. Now accelerated up to now in 2022. Just perspectives from watching all of that evolve. In some ways, is it kind of like what you said, Brian, gaming's always popular and it's always growing. You just only notice it in certain ways. Or have you also seen that this is now a new evolution because the blockchain space, because you can now play inside and outside of that gaming universe?
Yeah. So one of the things about the big shifts in gaming growth has been, first of all, it has been just acknowledging that, there's a kind of skill needed for gaming to play with a fun entertainment device that was interactive. Those were the console wars in the early days, Atari, then Sega, then Nintendo, right? All these devices that came about, Sony PlayStation, the first generation. And then it hit a bit of a sort of slower growth. And that slower growth happened because the gaming wasn't the hardware limitation anymore. It was a limitation of skill needed to play the game. Meaning that in order to play a game well, in around 2007 and 8 and 9, that period of time, pre-smartphone gaming, you needed to know how to use a console controller, which had many buttons and it was kind of complicated, right? And so it became sort of really much more what people define as hardcore gaming. People who play almost professionally, even though the esports industry really didn't exist. And so it started slow growth, and we're talking about hundreds of millions of gamers, but not yet billions. And then the smartphone came about. And the real innovation that the smartphone delivered to gaming wasn't the fact that it was a game in the pocket. That was, of course, part of the access. But, the Nintendo already had a portable game device with the Game Boy way before that. So portable gaming already existed before the smartphone. It was the fact that you could play a game and be really good at it through the swipe of a finger. If you remember Angry Birds or even
Yep.
things like Candy, what it really did was it completely amateurized gameplay. So suddenly we found a market where there were actually billions of people who loved playing games, but couldn't play the games because they were just too difficult. And sort of similar to what Instagram did to photography, the smartphone actually did that to gaming at large, where basically game designers had to now create fun and engaging games where the skill level was essentially easy to get into, but obviously difficult to master. And it then got people into things like, Candy Crush or like Clash Royale, or obviously Angry Birds as the originator of metaverse. These were simple gameplay, but a lot of fun to play and very easy for someone to get into. And that's how the gaming industry grew from hundreds of millions of players to 2.7 billion today. But there are 5 billion people or so that are online today. And because everyone has a smartphone today, there's actually basically a little more than 30 or 40% of the world, of the global internet connected world, that has had access to games, but still chooses not to play these games. Because for them, even the swiping of a finger or the interaction is either too tedious or not fun or not interesting. This is where this introduction of gaming and value becomes powerful, as we have seen with things like Rev Racing or Axie Infinity or even Sandbox, because now you can interact in the gaming world in financial value ways, in a more passive way. In other words, I can be involved in the game, but I don't actually have to play the game, because in order to be able to engage in this world, I need to be a good player still, right? There's still an amount of skill involved. It's a little bit like saying you can't actually play basketball unless you know how to shoot at least 10 hoops in a row, right? And that means if we do that, then actually we would be canceling out perhaps 2/3 of the audience, because we would never be able to qualify to be able to enjoy basketball because we can't meet that high bar, right? Now, that's kind of what gaming is today. So in order for you to engage in gaming, you need skill, right? Even if it's a simple skill, which smartphone has done, it's still too hard for some. Now, what if you entered a game where you could just watch it and you could actually maybe buy, your car and give it to someone else to race, and you can basically be excited about the outcome of the car? Or if you were, having a bunch of Axies and you actually were renting it out to other players who were using your Axies, you would be a participant in the game. You would be just as emotionally engaged, but it isn't your skill. To us, it's not just a paradigm of offering value to the gaming system and offering sort of economic value, but it's bringing in all the other people who wish they could engage in the gaming world, but couldn't because the skill level was too high. Well, guess what? Now I can passively engage.
Wow. All right. Now that really helps me understand it much better. So again, we'll get to the value chain because that's fascinating, but you make a good point. I mean, NFL is one of the most watched sports in the world, but very few people could tackle someone in the NFL or even throw a spiral with a football. And yet people love to engage. Same with basketball. And it's a good point about gaming. First of all, the Angry Birds, yeah, like you said, it was simple to play and it got people involved. But I remember trying to play Grand Theft Auto, I think 10 years ago, and the controller was so complicated. I just wasn't very good at it, and I kind of quit quickly. And it was, again, maybe only for a reserved audience that wanted to put the time in. But you want to get everybody involved in gaming based on their skill level is what you're trying to do.
Well, no. So, I mean, yes, of course, we want everyone to get involved in sort of gaming, but really what we want to do is get everyone involved in joining the metaverse. And gaming is the angle to do that best, because gamers today already have a relationship which is quasi-metaverse. So the metaverse obviously is not a new term in and of itself. But when you take a look at history, if we had talked about the metaverse 20 years ago, it would have been way too early for people to think about something like this being possible, because the audience of the world wasn't quite ready for that. But now we've gone through 3, maybe even 4 generations of people who have played games, who are very comfortable with this, who treat their virtual gaming experiences really as very real anyway. And by real, I don't mean that they think there's value there per se, but they look at these experiences as precious to them. They look forward to the game. They make friendships there. There's real feelings, emotions, love, hate, whatever feelings they have, those are real. And so now this virtual plane of engagement is very, very real to them and very meaningful. And so it's missing that one thing, which is true ownership. And it's missing something that makes it even more meaningful to them, not in an immersive way, but in a substantial, maybe economic or emotional way. And that's where the metaverse comes in with true ownership. And I want to stress true ownership because only the open metaverse can really offer that. And that is actually what we care about. And gaming is essentially the way to get most people in there, because they already have a sort of, metaverse is 0.5 experience.
And how do you define metaverse? If you had to tell my mother what the metaverse is, or tell someone on the streets, you kind of described it there, but how would you tell it to a cold audience? What is it?
Well, at a very surface level, right? For the basic one, it's basically the virtual plane. It's the metaverse in the sense that it's the meta land, which essentially is a virtual existence where all of us, as citizens of the world, as it were, citizens of the metaverse, would interact, virtually with communities, and with one big difference. So I say the real metaverse, just like in the physical world, only can really become real and meaningful to us when we actually have a stake in it, right? And that's what makes it real. If we don't own a stake in it, just like in the physical world, then actually it's not really real at all. It's basically, make believe, or we're working for someone else. But either way, it's not reality as we would define it, right? But to make it real, you have to own a stake in this. So our biggest differentiator about, if you take a look at what, say, Facebook, or even today Microsoft announced, or just about every other company, I'm just counting down to which company isn't doing the metaverse pitch, right? However, looking at what companies like Facebook are doing, they want the metaverse to be their place to be under their particular environment. And, to me, that's not the metaverse. That's Disneyland. It might be fun to be there, but you actually don't have ownership in there. And it's fun to be there for a few days. But if you actually had to really live there for the rest of your life, it's going to be a nightmare. It's going to be very dystopian. And that's kind of where we think the open metaverse is different. And so I would say, the real metaverse is the one that is open, in one that is owned by the majority, right? And therefore has the interest of the majority in mind, not the minority, which is what the closed metaverse is actually more like.
And this is a discussion we have on this program all the time, this concept of kind of Web 2.0 to Web 3.0, where Web 2.0 was incredible innovations, companies like Facebook and Google that offered you all this access to information, and we connected with people in an amazing way. But ultimately, they were controlled by the gatekeepers and the data owned by the gatekeepers. So the equity holders of Facebook got the capital appreciation. Mark Zuckerberg basically made the calls. And it's a great service, but you don't own it, which means it will always be someone else's version. And it also doesn't necessarily grow as fast. Whereas you look at blockchain and crypto assets, it is kind of that ultimate Web 3.0 where it's open source, open code. And so when you see an announcement like last week where Facebook's literally changing their name to Meta and going Meta, and obviously they own the Oculus hardware and have for many years, you look at that as saying, well, wait a second, that's still a Web 2.0 version of something that should be more 3.0 and completely individual ownership. Am I getting that right?
Yes. Well, I think absolutely. And I think one of the things about Facebook, first of all, Mark Zuckerberg is an insanely smart man, right? Let's just to be clear here. So as far as I think, he's mapped out the future and he knows where decentralization and blockchain and NFTs are going. I mean, he even tried to push out Libra, right, before it became DM, right? Meaning that he's got an eye for this and he understands what's happening, which also means he understands actually what the power of NFTs represent, which could possibly unravel the current data kingdom that Facebook has set up. So how do you combat that? Well, the way to combat that is to say, well, first of all, we need to own that term. So by calling yourself Meta, you're actually, basically arranging a sort of a scenario where when people have dinner conversations or coffee chats, and they talk about the metaverse, Facebook will be the natural sort of point of conversation because, oh, you're talking about the Facebook thing, aren't you, right? Because the majority of the world doesn't quite understand what metaverse is. It's still only a minority that appreciates Web3 and understands what it truly means. So you could say it is a masterful PR stroke to basically try to claim that. And frankly, very few companies could do that because even if a new company emerged, and there's many companies out there called Meta already, but in fact, our holding company of the Sandbox is actually called Meta, right? Okay. It was Meta, of course, long before Facebook called itself Meta. But the issue is that, we're not that famous. We're not that influential. So we could call ourselves anything we want. It doesn't matter, right? But if Facebook calls itself Meta and rebrands itself, then everyone else will talk about that. And eventually they get to own the term metaverse, right? And I think this is really, I would say, the attempt here to say that when people think metaverse, they should be thinking Facebook. And therefore, naturally, they would be going to Facebook to experience the metaverse. And that to me is, arguably perhaps the biggest threat because, this is where what we want to prevent. Otherwise, it's going to be the same scenario as Web 2. That said, I don't think it can succeed because anytime you build in an open environment like this, typically speaking, the economies of scale and the benefits are typically larger. And so if you're trying to build a closed ecosystem, you always have to subsidize and sort of recreate and create the scales of economy necessary to maintain that. In the physical world, we see this happening already. Anyone who does not participate in sort of free trade or participate in sort of global trade and global economies, in whatever ways they do, they get locked out, right? And essentially, actually, the economies are non-sustainable. North Korea being perhaps a perfect example, that are really just propped up for artificial reasons, but not actually really sustainable, as an example, right? And the same will happen basically in the digital world. But Facebook is big enough that it can afford to sort of play this out and try to sort of dominate that space as far as they can. Which is why it's so important to get digital property rights into everyone's hands. Because one of the reasons why the Web 2 framework has worked for Facebook is that people don't value data. Data is the most valuable resource on earth, right? And it's what powers Facebook and Amazon and Tencent and Google and all those companies, right? All the company by market cap size, the biggest in the world, they're all data-rich companies. And that's because they're getting our data for free, farming it, and then basically selling it back to us in the form of advertising and services. And we're just willingly do it because we don't understand the value of data, because we don't appreciate that data ought to be a property that we create and therefore we own. Whereas in the physical world, though, if I buy a house or if I own this property, if it was inherited, I know it's mine, and I will fight tooth and nail to ensure that it is always mine, or I have the right to pass it on, which means I therefore care about the institution that protects it. I care about, who is elected in government. I care about democracy because I care about the system that ensures my property is protected. And we all have a stake in this because we all own property. So it protects itself as a result of this majority interest, and this majority interest in the common goal. In the sort of framework of where you don't own any data, which is basically Web 2, you're renters. Actually, you don't know what you're protecting. There's nothing you need to protect because I don't own it anyway. So yeah, you just go take it, right? And so it becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. So that's why if we can create the ownership paradigm and have people understand that digital property is valuable, in fact, and that it's something you ought to protect, then they start thinking, well, where is it stored? Who owns it and who controls it? Oh, wait a second. I don't want to go put that into some place that can take it away anytime. That's why we're in such a rush to deliver that. If you have a CryptoPunk, or if you've got a big piece of plot of land in Sandbox that could be worth $1 million, for instance, no way are you going to give it to someone who can take it away at any time.
Yeah, you've called this like digital colonialism, where they take our data and sell it back to us. And I think you've called yourself someone similar to someone walking around in the medieval times trying to tell people that you should have property rights, and everyone's thinking, what are you talking about? I mean, because we've been conditioned to give up our data because we didn't know how valuable it was. And every now and then we see like a pressure point where we realize it. Last year, we came up against some real issues with freedom of speech and owning our content and getting it broadcast on Web 2.0 platforms. And it was a real good question of who owns this content, who has the right to see it, who's stopping it from being seen, is there real democratization here? And we see every now and then these pain points come out, probably because we don't have that digital ownership. And it kind of rears its head and we realize that we don't have that. And so for you, that's really important for you, is owning your own rights and data, which probably takes us right into the way you look at NFTs. And I think you've described NFTs as stores of culture because they embody a moment in history. You've said, what is art? Art stores culture. Also, NFTs in the game is your identity, your history, etc. Can you talk to me about what is an NFT and how you see it from kind of the metaverse, and then how it also now it comes into our physical world?
So NFTs, as you pointed out, right, as stores of culture, well, they're cultures that are not necessarily only cultures meaning for like a mass community. They could also just be your personal culture, right? So for instance, like a wedding ring. Wedding rings are very personal to you. They're not super valuable maybe to the outside community, but to your own family and to your own very small community, they are priceless. But yet it's still made of silver or platinum, it maybe has an etching on it. That doesn't make it special, but we have something that treasures it because there's a story, there's a memory, there's something in there that means so much to us and maybe only us. Now, that's something you couldn't do in the digital world because we didn't own that asset. That asset was rented in effect. So we could maybe make an association, which we often do, but the actual ability to pass it on and really treasure that moment historically forever is difficult to do. When we think about historical artifacts, religious artifacts, for instance, of thousands of years ago, we treasure them very deeply because of the powerful idea that they embody, except that in and of itself, maybe that cloth or that material isn't special. But the powerful thing is that what it represents is unbeatable, right? Because it's really, as people, we're moved by these ideas and these concepts. Now let's talk about NFTs and why exactly they've become so powerful, just as they're parallel in the physical world. And it's because, when you look at Web 2, the one thing that survived this ability to be truly free and openly composable was actually open source. Everything is developed on open source today. Even the biggest of companies like a Google or Facebook, they all leverage open source today because it has the most weight. And it has the most weight because someone has built maybe a base code for, something very basic, straightforward. And then another person writes code on top. And actually what they're really doing, right, is they're adding, through the addition of new code on top of the old code, mixing their culture, which is really, a culture of code, but it's still culture because we're run, the way the system works, the UX, the interface, it's a representation of someone's idea of how it should be done, which is his or her culture. And that gets represented in the form of that code. That code has become so powerful because tens of millions of people contributed on a regular basis that it is the reason why IBM has to use it. And is the reason also why a 5 or 10 person organization can now compete with the biggest of companies. And because of the fact that they have the world's knowledge at their fingertips in terms of code. And it also birthed companies like Google, like Huawei, like Lenovo, like pretty much every other company that's right, including the blockchain industry, right? If it wasn't for open source, actually the blockchain industry couldn't thrive. So that's a perfect example of how this open composability came from layers of experiences that were added on top of this to make this really data-rich, super sort of data powerful, shall we say, sort of super gravity effect in terms of the network effect that this code had. But there's a problem with open source code, which is only people who know how to code can sort of harness that, right? And most of the world doesn't know how to code still in this century. And, we try to solve this by doing hour of code and pushing all our children to learn how to code. And unfortunately, we can say that while we're getting mass awareness, we have failed in getting mass awareness of how to code, right? At the end of the day, we don't have 80% enrollment in computer science in college, right? And so most of the world is still not studying computer science. So what that means is that actually we created a digital elite. That digital elite is the people who know how to code, and they were able to benefit from that experience. Non-fungible tokens provides exactly the same framework in an open sort of a data structure where you can compose on top. Except now you can do it with assets that don't require you to code. It could be a piece of art, it could be music, it could be anything that your imagination will create and allow you to create, because you no longer need to know how to code to get it out there. And people can also freely compose on top of it. And as a result, one asset that may have been produced for a certain fashion, someone else can invent and create something new and create new utility on top of it. That actually becomes really powerful because one asset may have been purpose for one thing, but now has 100 different use cases because it's used in 5 games. You could put a mortgage on it. You could lend it. It could be fractionalized. All these different use cases that are emerging through third parties simply because you own it and no longer needing permission from the platform. This opens up all new possibilities, but really, it's really doing what the physical world already had, but now in the digital context. And that's what non-fungible tokens are able to do. They're able to open this up to the rest of the world at a skill level that everyone can participate in, because non-fungible tokens are assets that you can participate in where you don't really have to know how to code. One of the favorite examples I like to put about this composability is like in the form of digital in cars, because we sell digital cars with Rev Racing, for instance, or Formula E. And what's interesting is that in the physical world, there's so many industries that have developed, on the side of people who own cars without any permission of the car itself, whether it's drivers, mechanics, service companies, or baby seats. Like I love the story of baby seats because cars, when Henry Ford made the car, he was never thinking about, well, this is a car where children are going to go. No, it was just 30 years afterwards that some people said, you know what, I think we can use this as a way to transport our children. We're going to do it in a way that's more convenient. Let's invent this clunky baby seat. And this was not done with permission from any car company, right? And now, interesting enough, car companies have to design the cars in a way that have safety standards that support the implementation of these baby seats. So you have a scenario where actually an external factor came in to influence the way you have to co-participate and co-create for the benefit of both. Right? That's something that in a permission environment you simply can't do, because some person who has no idea about, or empathy about the needs might just simply say, who needs this anyway? And they'll just say no to it because, smaller organizations don't have the the innovation idea pool is so small that, you won't imagine that's possible. You just nix it, which is what happens all the time in digital platforms, who basically refuse access on the basis of it's not suitable. But who said it wasn't suitable? Why are you the judge of it, right?
Right. I used to have a 1968 Ford Mustang when I was in high school, and I used to, I changed the color. It wasn't factory. I changed the engine. I put the new rims on, and it was mine, and it meant a lot to me, even though it only cost me $1,200, which I had to earn through my summer jobs. But, that was my creation. And again, I didn't have to ask permission from Ford, and I could go ahead and do that. And so right now we see NFTs, the ones that make the news are these JPEGs. And I think a lot of people have a hard time seeing the multi-dimensionality and future of what an NFT can become. They can see it more through your games like Revs, where you can own these digital cars and they can change over time. How do you try to get people to see the future of NFTs when sometimes all we see is an ETH rock or all we see is an ape, and we're just like, I don't get it. I try to tell people the first experience with the internet for most people was an email. I sent my first email in 1989. I was at MIT, and I didn't send one for 3 years later because there was nothing to do there. And I thought that was the internet. Little did I know it would become something greater later. Are we in a similar stage with NFTs? And how can you kind of tell people that they're going to change?
Well, first of all, I think we're more advanced than that first email you sent in terms of evolution, which is good news, I hope. But the other thing I would say is, one of the things when people look at these JPEGs, and of course that's the big joke within our industry, is like, oh, look, I bought another JPEG for like $1 million. How silly is that, right? But I think what it represents, that ownership, the power of that is really the messaging, the art, the virtual aspect of it is actually really, if you think about it historically, and I'll go into gaming utility shortly after, but really on those things, whether it's a CryptoPunk or Bored Ape, it is no different than buying a Birkin bag, or having a Rolex watch, or buying a Ferrari, for instance. And what it does is it's an invitation to a kind of, let's say, membership, a proof of your success, maybe an inclusion of a club. When you buy a Birkin bag, what are you buying? You're not actually buying the materials it's made of. Yes, maybe you think you can touch and feel it, but actually in reality, 99.9% of that value is entirely virtual. You're buying a story. You're buying a creation of a wonderful, wonderful, construction that might look beautiful in your eyes because it was invented from the mind of that designer, right? When you buy a Picasso, what are you buying? You're not buying the canvas or the material. You're buying Picasso. You're buying his story. You're buying his idea, right? And that is a thing. Now, when we talk about stores of culture, people sometimes buy things historically because they mean something. Oh, maybe the Renaissance period meant something to me. Or when people talk about modern art in China, it means something for Chinese people because modern art is kind of this sort of symbol of where China is today, for instance, right? Or when people buy, for instance, a lot of people bought up old historical relics from the past as a way to sort of preserve their own history and culture. Again, the material isn't valuable, but the story and the power of, those stories that are embedded in there is why you have it. And it means so much to you personally, kind of like that wedding ring as well, right? And again, it doesn't have to mean something to millions of people. It could, right? The Mona Lisa is an interesting contradiction if you think about it in that context. It's, arguably the most valuable painting in the world, yet it is the most accessible because you can download it on the internet anytime you want. You can go there, snap all sorts of photos you want. It's in every magazine. But you know what? The reason why that original is so valuable is because the whole world knows it. Right? And this is the thing when people say, oh, I can just download that JPEG. Well, that's great. But do you own the original? Because the one who does own the original, his piece of art just got more famous because you downloaded it and put it on your screen. Thank you very much. Please keep doing that because my original becomes more valuable. So that is one, I would say, when people sort of struggling with this thought, right? I think what you're buying, this authenticity, is when you think about everything you buy in your real world, you're actually craving for authenticity as well. Would you buy a fake Nike or real Nike? Why do you want an original Apple versus a fake Apple? Like, why wouldn't you get the fake one that maybe functionally does exactly the same thing? You want the original, right? Because, and that's the same thing, when it comes to sort of NFTs, like, those JPEGs that people sort of, complain about. But the NFTs for utility in terms of gaming, those are more easily understood. But those have much more value, I think, in terms of people who are more, let's say, pragmatic thinking. Because, the world is not all people who think the same way, right? In the same way that, honestly speaking, I struggle with the idea of a Birkin bag. I intellectually understand it, but I can't get myself to buy one because it just doesn't make sense to me, right? Just like how for some of us, we look at diamonds and we say, actually, that's not really valuable. Yet people desire it, right? So each to their own, as one would say. But for gaming NFTs, the utility is clear because you can make a clear ROI. One of our sort of F1 Delta Time cars, it's sold in the secondary market for $340,000. It's a lot of money. The headline article wasn't, oh my goodness, who spent $340,000 on a virtual car? How ridiculous is that? The headline was, here's a Lamborghini that costs just the same. Here's the virtual car. Which one makes you money? And this is the thing. We buy cars all the time as status symbols that are depreciating assets. It's something that tells us about who we are. And yet a virtual car for the same amount of money, not only does it last forever, it can generate 20, 30% or more yield a year, right? Well, geez, right? In that sense, it's very logical to be doing this. And that is the reason also why these assets inside games like Axie Infinity or Land and Sandbox, for instance, are becoming valuable, because there's real utility in which you could be earning money from it. And so that's where the gaming NFTs are logical. But again, if you just consider everything you purchase, from the clothes, from the assets you purchase yourself, what percentage of that decision-making came from the actual sort of material value, the physical value? And the chances are very little of it, probably.
Yeah, there's some great ideas in there. It's funny you mentioned the Birkin bag and why you buy it. The crazy thing is that these days, you're also going to display that bag 99% of the time virtually, right? The picture of that bag on Instagram is how you really want to use that bag. Whereas maybe 20 years ago, you would show up to the party with the bag. Now you can get 100x flex factor doing it via the internet, and also maybe even via the blockchain, proving that you own it. So that's become different. I've been to the Louvre in Paris. The Mona Lisa is very unimpressive when you actually see it. It's tiny. It's actually not that impressive, but the idea of it is the whole point, the story behind it, the idea that it is the most important and scarce asset is what gives it all of that value. And then you talk about the fake. Anyone buying like the fake, Prada bag or Birkin bag, again, that even shows they're actually buying into the story and the brand, which is why they want the fake anyways. They don't want to tell people it's a fake because they're buying into the actual brand, right? So even that shows this duality of us as humans, where you're right, it's not even the materials in that case. It's because we want it to be the story, the thing, the real thing.
Right. Yeah. People don't go around saying, look at my fake Rolex. Isn't that awesome? Wow, I got a great deal, right? People actually would be embarrassed if they actually said that. And this is the thing now with blockchain, is that authenticity actually is provable right from the source right away. It's literally like if you're walking around and you're wearing a fake, it's blinking red, right, the whole time, which basically is actually great for creators, because now they can actually verifiably prove, whether it's a fake or whether it's an original, because it's on blockchain. And I think this is also the community aspect, which is so powerful, because it's no longer just about getting validation from the original creator, who maybe potentially might sue you if you have a fake. It's a community. The community or people who have an original are not going to accept someone who has a fake. They're just going to say, you're not part of it. You are a fake, right? And that actually being excluded from that community, when you so desire to be part of that community, which is why you associate yourself with these assets, is actually, frankly, the bigger threat. It's the bigger deterrent. You don't want to be caught out because otherwise you will be forever banished from that community you so want to be a part of.
Yeah, I did a video on Monday where I put up a picture of a bunch of monkeys out on the savannah, and I was saying not much has really changed. Back then we were all, fighting for social order, who was grooming who was doing this, and your social order got you rights of access to mating, to eating, maybe even survival, and we're still programmed in to do that, whether we realize it or not. And like you said, being removed from the community is probably the worst possible thing. I mean, what do we do in prisons? We put people in solitary confinement. And so everything we do, whether we like to admit it or not, is all vying for position in the social order. It's your LinkedIn profile. It's the suit you're wearing. It's everything. is all of us doing that. So once we can admit it, it's an easier way, I think, to try to understand some of these NFTs and these metaverses. I want to go further on that point where you said that in a game like Rev, you have an asset that actually creates a return now, as opposed to, like you said, a depreciating asset like a Lambo in person. You know, I forced myself to dive down the Axie Infinity rabbit hole a couple weeks ago. And I'm telling you, Yat, I went on there on a Sunday. I bought my Axies. It wasn't easy. I had to get my MetaMask wallet out, pay my gas fees. I bought my 3 Axies. I put them on the screen and they had their first battle. Actually, one of them died and I was like, I fell off my chair because I thought I just lost a few $100s at ETH, but it was just in the game. He reappeared later. I was like, okay, cool. But first time I got it, I said, okay, wow, these are real assets that were created by hard work by other people that I had to buy in order to participate in this game where I could then earn tokens that are now exchangeable on the blockchain for fiat currency if I wish. And I know this is changing economies in places like the Philippines where people are now turning this into a living. People are now allowing people to rent these assets and play this for them. And I'm starting to understand what you're creating with Sandbox and many of your other companies as well, where these things are no longer virtual environments. They border right back into the physical, and they really are a clear demonstrator that the metaverse is here to stay, and it's really part of who we are as humans. Tell me just your thoughts on this, and if I'm getting any of that stuff right, you know, when it comes to seeing what these games do as far as utility.
Yeah, first of all, you get it completely right. And I think, we're very fortunate to have been sort of the lead investor of Axie Infinity, Sky Mavis, back in 2019. And I got to tell you, that was a difficult raise. Everyone was, back then, sort of Bitcoin itself was, not doing so well. So the world was fleeing fungible tokens. And then here we are trying to sort of, market a non-fungible version of that. You can imagine how much fun that was. But, the thing is, the thing that's fascinating about when you think about what happened in the Philippines with Axie Infinity, it didn't happen because Axie set up an office, the Sky Mavis team set up an office and did something there and built it out. It happened because, what ultimately became YGG, right, basically set up this experiment independent of Axie and just said, hey, let's do this. We own these Axies, we're breeding them. Let's use this as a way for people to actually sort of survive through COVID and make an income. And then they saw it work. And it's an example of this open composability that can take place without the permission of the platform. Sky Mavis is a Vietnamese-based company. They, obviously have empathy for what happens in the region, but they don't know exactly what's happening in the Philippines. And, why did this same phenomenon not happen in the Philippines, in Vietnam, where they're based, versus Philippines? Who knows, right? But it just happened somewhere else, far away from their home, from a third party who was a friend of the company, but obviously not working for them, and then ended up building this construct that now has basically taken over the world in terms of potential of what...
To continue watching the rest of the episode for free, visit our website londonreal.tv or click the link in the description below.